Marcus stood at the edge of the canyon, his hands shaking as he gripped the rough stone ledge. The wind whipped through his dark hair and tears mixed with the dust on his weathered face. At 32 years old, he felt like his life had crumbled into nothing. The divorce papers in his back pocket felt heavier than the rocks beneath his feet. 6 months ago, everything seemed perfect. He had a beautiful wife named Sarah, a cozy house in the suburbs, and a job at the local construction company that paid the bills. But life has a way of pulling the rug out from under people when they least expect it. Sarah had been acting strange for weeks, coming home late and avoiding his eyes during dinner. When he finally confronted her, the truth hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. "I've been seeing someone else," she had whispered, unable to look at him directly. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I didn't plan for this to happen." The words echoed in his mind as he stared down at the rocky bottom of the canyon, hundreds of feet below. His boss had fired him just 2 weeks after Sarah moved out, claiming the company was downsizing. But Marcus knew the real reason. He'd been showing up late, making mistakes, and his mind was always somewhere else. The bills started piling up like autumn leaves, and soon the bank was threatening to take his house. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another debt collector. He'd stopped answering calls weeks ago. His family lived 3 states away, and he was too proud to tell them how badly his life had fallen apart. His few friends had tried to help at first, but Marcus had pushed them away, preferring to drink alone in his empty house. The canyon stretched out before him, beautiful and deadly. The red rocks glowed in the afternoon sun, and somewhere far below a small stream wound its way through the desert floor. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting against the current that seemed determined to drag him under. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The desert air filled his lungs, dry and warm. He thought about his childhood, about his father who had taught him to be strong, to never give up. But what was the point of being strong when everything you cared about was gone? A tear rolled down his cheek as he loosened his grip on the ledge. This wasn't how he had imagined his life would turn out. He had dreamed of growing old with Sarah, maybe having children, building something meaningful together. Now those dreams lay in pieces around his feet like broken glass. The silence of the desert surrounded him, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. He wondered if anyone would miss him, if Sarah would feel guilty when she heard the news. Probably not. She seemed happy with her new life, her new man. Marcus opened his eyes and looked down again. The rocks below seemed to call to him, promising an end to the pain that had been eating away at his heart for months. He had driven out here without really knowing why, following some instinct that led him to this remote spot in the Arizona desert. Maybe this was where he was supposed to be. His grip loosened another inch and small pebbles tumbled over the edge, disappearing into the void below. The sound they made when they hit the bottom was too faint to hear, but he imagined it anyway. Soon, he thought, soon he would join them in that peaceful silence. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, Marcus had to admit. If these were going to be his last moments, at least he was surrounded by something magnificent. The thought brought him a strange kind of comfort. He thought about writing a note, but what would it say? That he was sorry? That life had become too much to bear? The words seemed inadequate, too small to contain the enormity of his pain. Better to let his absence speak for itself. Marcus took another deep breath and prepared to let go completely. In his mind, he said goodbye to the life he had known, to the dreams that would never come true, to the man he used to be before everything went wrong. The wind picked up, as if nature itself was urging him forward into the unknown. Just as Marcus was about to release his hold on the rocky ledge, a sound cut through the desert silence. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew clearer as he strained to listen. Someone was singing. The voice belonged to a woman, and though he couldn't make out the words, the melody was hauntingly beautiful. It seemed to float up from somewhere below, carried on the desert breeze like a message from another world. Marcus froze, his fingers tightening instinctively on the stone. Where was the singing coming from? He had been certain he was alone out here, miles from the nearest town. The parking area where he'd left his truck was empty except for his own vehicle. Yet the voice was unmistakably real, growing stronger and more distinct with each passing moment. Curiosity began to wrestle with despair in Marcus's chest. He had come here to end his pain, but now something unexpected was happening. The voice was unlike anything he had ever heard, pure and clear, with a quality that seemed to reach right into his soul and touch something he thought had died weeks ago. Against his better judgment, Marcus found himself pulling back from the edge slightly, trying to locate the source of the singing. He wiped his eyes and peered down into the canyon, scanning the rocky slopes and narrow trails that zigzagged down the cliff face. There, about 50 feet below him on a small ledge, he spotted movement. A figure sat cross-legged on the narrow shelf of rock, facing out toward the canyon. From this distance, Marcus could see it was an elderly woman with long gray hair that caught the sunlight. She wore simple clothes, a faded blue dress and worn leather boots, and her voice rose and fell with the natural rhythm of someone who had been singing all her life. Marcus stared in amazement. How had she gotten down there? The ledge she sat on was accessible only by a treacherous path that wound down the canyon wall, requiring considerable skill and courage to navigate. What was an old woman doing in such a dangerous place? As if sensing his presence, the woman stopped singing and looked up. Even from this distance, Marcus could see her eyes were bright and alert. She raised one weathered hand and waved at him, as casual as if they were neighbors meeting on a city sidewalk. "Beautiful afternoon, isn't it?" She called up to him, her voice carrying clearly in the thin desert air. Marcus was speechless. Here he stood on the verge of ending his life, and this mysterious woman was making small talk about the weather. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time in months he felt something other than despair. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was different. It was surprise. "Are you all right up there?" the woman asked, squinting up at him with concern. "You look like you might be in some trouble." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he explain what he was doing here? How could he tell this stranger that moments ago he had been ready to throw himself into the canyon? The woman seemed to understand his silence. She nodded thoughtfully and then did something completely unexpected. She reached beside her and picked up what looked like a wooden bow. Not the kind used for hunting, but a simple curved piece of wood. She placed it across her knees and began to run her fingers along its surface, creating a soft, rhythmic sound that blended with the wind. "Sometimes," she called up to him, "when life gets too heavy to carry, we forget that we don't have to carry it alone." Her words hit Marcus harder than any of the well-meaning advice his friends had tried to give him. There was something about the way she said it without judgment or pity that made him really hear the message. He realized he had been carrying his pain like a burden that belonged only to him, never considering that others might understand or be willing to help. "I don't even know you," Marcus called down, his voice cracking slightly. The woman smiled, and even from 50 feet away, Marcus could feel the warmth of it. "Names are just words we use to separate ourselves from each other. But pain and hope, those are things we all share." She continued to stroke the wooden bow, creating a sound that was part music, part rhythm, part magic. The notes seemed to vibrate through the air and into Marcus's bones, loosening something tight in his chest that had been wound like a spring for months. "Why are you down there?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious now. "Same reason you're up there, I imagine," she replied, "looking for something. The difference is, I found what I was looking for a long time ago." Marcus felt his grip on the ledge becoming more secure rather than less. The immediate urge to let go had passed, replaced by a strange fascination with this unexpected encounter. Who was this woman, and how did she seem to know exactly what to say? The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and the canyon walls began to glow with deeper shades of red and orange. The woman's voice rose again in song, this time a different melody that seemed to speak of journeys and discoveries, of paths that led through darkness and into light. Marcus found himself sitting down on the rocky ledge, his legs dangling over the edge but his grip now firm and steady. The immediate crisis had passed, replaced by an intense curiosity about the woman below. She had stopped singing and was now carefully making her way up the narrow trail that led to his position. "Don't move," she called up to him. "I'm coming up to join you. That ledge you're on isn't the safest place for a conversation." As she climbed, Marcus got a better look at her. She was probably in her 70s, but she moved with the confidence and agility of someone much younger. Her gray hair was braided with small feathers and beads, and around her neck hung a simple leather cord with a small stone pendant. Most remarkably, she carried the wooden bow slung across her back like a treasured possession. When she reached the top, she settled down beside him with a soft grunt of effort. Up close, Marcus could see that her face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from smiling often. and her dark eyes held a depth that seemed to reflect the canyon itself. "I'm Elena," she said simply, extending her hand to him. "Marcus," he replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm and warm, calloused from years of work but gentle in its touch. "Now then, Marcus," Elena said, settling herself more comfortably on the rock. "Want to tell me what brought you to the edge of this canyon today?" The question was asked without judgment, as naturally as if she were asking about his favorite color. Something about her manner made Marcus feel safe enough to tell the truth. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "My wife left me for another man. I lost my job. I'm about to lose my house."
"I came out here because I didn't want to fight anymore." Elena nodded thoughtfully as if she had heard similar stories many times before.
"And you thought jumping would solve those problems?" "I thought it would end them," Marcus corrected. "Ah," Elena said, reaching for the wooden bow she had carried up the cliff. "There's a difference between solving and ending, isn't there?" She held the bow up to the light, and Marcus could see it was beautifully crafted, carved from a single piece of what looked like mesquite wood. The surface was smooth and polished, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. "This bow," Elena said, running her fingers along its curves, "belonged to my grandfather. He was a musician, a storyteller, and one of the wisest men I ever knew. When I was about your age, I went through a time very much like what you're experiencing now." Marcus looked at her with surprise. It was hard to imagine this serene woman ever experiencing the kind of despair that had brought him to this place. "I lost my husband in a car accident," Elena continued, her voice steady but touched with old sadness. "We had been married for only 3 years, and I was pregnant with our first child. The grief was so overwhelming that I lost the baby too, from the stress and sorrow." Marcus felt his chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said. Elena smiled sadly. "I wanted to die. I felt like I had been hollowed out from the inside, like there was nothing left of me that mattered. I came to this very canyon, actually, with much the same intention you had today." "What stopped you?" Marcus asked. Elena held up the wooden bow. "My grandfather found me here. He was in his 80s then, but he had walked miles into the desert looking for me. He sat down right where I'm sitting now and began to play this bow." She demonstrated, placing the bow against her lips and breathing across it while plucking the string. The sound was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. Part flute, part harp, part human voice. It seemed to capture the essence of the wind itself. "He played for hours," Elena continued, never saying a word. "And as he played, I began to remember things I had forgotten in my grief. I remembered the sound of my husband's laugh. I remembered the dreams we had shared. I remembered that love doesn't disappear just because the person you love is gone." Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story. When he finally stopped playing, "My grandfather asked me a question that changed everything. He asked me, if your husband could see you right now, what would he want you to do?" "What did you tell him?" "I knew the answer immediately," Elena said. "My husband would want me to live. He would want me to find a way to honor what we had shared by creating something beautiful with the rest of my life." She played another soft melody on the bow, this one lighter and more hopeful than the songs Marcus had heard from the canyon floor. "So I didn't jump that day. Instead, I learned to play this bow. I learned to sing the old songs. I dedicated my life to helping other people find their way back from the edge, just as my grandfather had helped me." Marcus stared out at the canyon, processing her words. "But how do you know if you're strong enough to rebuild? What if you try and fail again?" Elena set the bow aside and reached into a small leather pouch at her waist. She pulled out a smooth stone and placed it in Marcus's palm. "Feel this," she said. The stone was warm and perfectly round, polished smooth by countless years of wind and water. "This stone has been tumbling around this canyon for thousands of years," Elena explained. "Every storm, every flood, every wind has worn away its rough edges. It started as a jagged piece of rock, probably broken off from some cliff face by violence and trauma." Marcus turned the stone over in his hands, marveling at its smoothness. "But look at it now," Elena said. "All that battering and wearing down didn't destroy it. It made it into something beautiful, something perfect in its own way. The stone didn't choose what happened to it, but it survived it all and became more than it was before." Marcus held the smooth stone in his palm, feeling its weight and warmth. Elena's words echoed in his mind as the sun continued its journey toward the western horizon, painting the canyon in deeper shades of gold and crimson. I don't feel strong like this stone, Marcus said finally. I feel broken. Completely broken. Elena nodded with understanding. That's exactly how the stone felt when it first broke away from the cliff. But being broken isn't the end of the story, Marcus. It's often the beginning of becoming something new. She picked up her wooden bow again and began to play a soft, haunting melody. The notes seemed to dance with the evening breeze, creating a sound that was both melancholy and hopeful. Tell me about Sarah, Elena said gently while she played. What was she like when you first met her? Marcus hesitated. He hadn't spoken Sarah's name aloud to anyone in weeks, and the memories felt too tender to touch. But something about Elena's presence made it feel safe to remember. She was like sunshine, he said slowly, always laughing, always finding something beautiful in ordinary moments. She could make grocery shopping feel like an adventure. When she smiled, it was like the whole world got brighter. That sounds like a wonderful love, Elena observed. It was, Marcus agreed, his voice thick with emotion. At least I thought it was. But maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe she never really loved me the way I loved her. Elena stopped playing for a moment and looked at him directly. Love is never wasted, Marcus. Even when it doesn't last forever, even when it ends in pain, the love itself was real. It changed you, made you capable of deeper feeling than you had before. Then why does it hurt so much? Because you opened your heart completely, Elena replied. And when something that precious is lost, the empty space it leaves behind feels enormous. But that space isn't really empty, you know. It's full of all the love you shared, all the growth you experienced, all the ways you became a better person because of loving her. Marcus considered this as Elena resumed her gentle playing. He thought about the early days with Sarah, how loving her had made him want to be the best version of himself. He had become more patient, more thoughtful, more generous because he wanted to be worthy of her love. Even if she's gone, Elena continued, those changes in you remain. The kindness you learned, the capacity for joy she helped you discover, the dreams you dared to have, those are all still part of who you are. A hawk circled overhead, riding the warm air currents that rose from the canyon floor. Marcus watched it soar effortlessly, remembering how he and Sarah used to watch birds together from their kitchen window on Sunday mornings. But what about the future? Marcus asked. How do you rebuild when everything you planned for is gone? Elena smiled and reached into her pouch again, this time pulling out a small piece of wood roughly carved and unfinished. My grandfather gave me this the same day he played the bow for me. He said it was the beginning of a new bow, but it would take years of careful work to complete. She handed the piece to Marcus. It was clearly the work of many hands over many years. Some sections were smooth and refined, while others remained rough and unworked. I've been carving this for 43 years, Elena said. Sometimes I work on it every day. Sometimes I go months without touching it. But every time I return to it, I understand a little more about what it wants to become. Marcus ran his fingers over the wood, feeling the contrast between the finished and unfinished sections. You mean you still don't know what it's going to be? I have ideas, Elena said with a chuckle. But I've learned that the most beautiful things often become something different than what we first imagined. The wood has its own wisdom, its own grain and character. My job isn't to force it into a shape I've predetermined, but to work with what's already there and help it become its best possible self. The metaphor wasn't lost on Marcus. He thought about his own life, how rigidly he had planned everything with Sarah, how devastated he felt when those plans crumbled. Maybe Elena was suggesting that there were other possibilities he hadn't considered, other paths his life could take. The job you lost, Elena said, as if reading his thoughts. Was it something you loved doing? Marcus thought about this honestly. Not really, he admitted. It paid well and it was steady, but I never felt passionate about construction work. I used to dream about being a teacher when I was younger, but Sarah wanted financial security, so I stuck with construction. And the house you're about to lose? Too big for just me anyway, Marcus realized as he said it. We bought it because Sarah wanted space for the children we were planning to have. But it always felt cold to me, too formal. Elena nodded knowingly. Sometimes what feels like devastating loss is actually life clearing away things that weren't truly serving us, making space for something better to grow. The idea was revolutionary to Marcus. Instead of seeing himself as a victim of circumstances, Elena was suggesting he might be in the process of being liberated from a life that wasn't really his own. But how do you know what direction to go when everything familiar is gone? He asked. Elena placed the wooden bow across her knees and closed her eyes for a moment as if listening to something only she could hear. You start with what calls to your heart, she said finally. Not what seems practical or safe, but what makes you feel most alive. I don't know what that is anymore, Marcus confessed. Yes, you do, Elena said with quiet confidence. You're just afraid to admit it because it might lead you into uncertainty again. The desert sunset was beginning in earnest now, transforming the canyon into a cathedral of light and shadow. Marcus found himself breathing more deeply than he had in months, and for the first time since Sarah left, he felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. When I was a kid, Marcus said slowly, I used to love working with children. I volunteered at a summer camp for 3 years during high school. Those kids taught me more about joy and resilience than any adult ever did. Elena smiled encouragingly. Tell me more about that. There was this one boy named Tommy, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as the memory took hold. He was 8 years old and had been through foster care his whole life. He was angry and scared and didn't trust anyone. But by the end of that summer, he was laughing and playing with the other kids like he'd never been hurt. What changed for him? Someone believed in him, Marcus said simply. Someone took the time to see past his anger to the scared little boy underneath. Someone showed him that he mattered. Elena nodded thoughtfully. And how did that make you feel? Like I was doing exactly what I was meant to do, Marcus admitted. Like all the pieces of my life finally made sense. But you didn't pursue teaching? Marcus sighed. My father convinced me it wasn't practical. He said teachers don't make enough money to support a family. Then when I met Sarah, she agreed. She wanted security, a nice house, vacations. Teaching seemed too risky. Elena was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle between them. Finally, she spoke. What if I told you that the financial security you've been chasing was an illusion anyway? Marcus looked at her with surprise. What do you mean? You had the job, the house, the marriage, all the things that were supposed to provide security. But where did that security go when life got difficult? It disappeared like morning mist, didn't it? The truth of her words hit Marcus hard. He had built his entire adult life around pursuing safety and stability. But when the storms came, none of those things had protected him. Real security, Elena continued, comes from knowing who you are and trusting your ability to adapt and grow no matter what life throws at you. It comes from building a life based on your authentic values and gifts, not on what other people think you should want. She picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the canyon, watching it disappear into the growing shadows below. I've seen hundreds of people over the years who came to this edge, Elena said. Some were wealthy, some were poor. Some had big families, others were alone. But the ones who were suffering the most were those who had built their lives on foundations that weren't truly their own. Marcus thought about this as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Had he ever really chosen his own path? Or had he simply followed the expectations others had set for him? The children you worked with at that camp, Elena said, they're grown up now. Some of them probably have children of their own, but I'll bet that somewhere in their hearts, they still carry the gift you gave them, the knowledge that someone believed in them when they needed it most. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, of remembering a part of himself he had buried under years of practical decisions and other people's dreams. It's not too late, you know, Elena said gently. 32 is still young enough to start over, to choose a different path. But how? Marcus asked. I have no money, no job, no place to live. Even if I wanted to become a teacher, I'd need to go back to school, get certified. It would take years. Eleanor reached for her wooden bow and began to play again, this time a melody that seemed to speak of new beginnings and unexpected journeys. There are many ways to teach, she said while she played. Many ways to work with children who need someone to believe in them. Sometimes the most important lessons happen outside of classrooms, in places where traditional teachers never go. As if to illustrate her point, a coyote's howl echoed across the canyon, wild and free. The sound sent shivers down Marcus's spine, but they were good shivers, the kind that come from witnessing something authentic and untamed. I spent 43 years learning to live differently after my grandfather saved me from this ledge, Elena said. I never remarried, never had the children I thought I wanted. But I found other ways to nurture and guide. I learned traditional crafts and songs and stories from elders who were dying. I taught them to young people who had forgotten their heritage. I worked with troubled teenagers who had given up on themselves. She paused in her playing and looked directly at Marcus. I built a life that honored what I had lost while embracing what was still possible. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I was meant to live. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, like a lock that had been jammed for years finally turning. The path Elena was describing wasn't about replacing what he had lost with something identical. It was about discovering what had always been waiting beneath the surface of his conventional choices. "The camp where you volunteered," Elena said. "Is it still running?" Marcus nodded. "Last I heard, yes. It's called Pine Ridge Adventure Camp. They work with at-risk kids from the city." "Maybe," Elena suggested with a mysterious smile. "It's time for an old camper to come home." The stars were now fully visible overhead, creating a brilliant canopy that seemed to stretch infinitely beyond the canyon walls. Marcus had never noticed how many stars were visible when you got away from city lights. The sight filled him with a sense of wonder he hadn't experienced since childhood. "Elena," Marcus said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret not jumping that day? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your grandfather hadn't found you?" Elena was silent for a long moment, her fingers still moving gently across the bow's surface, creating soft whispers of sound that blended with the night breeze. "I think about it sometimes," she said finally, "but not with regret. I think about it with gratitude for the path not taken, and amazement at all the beauty I would have missed." She gestured toward the star-filled sky. "Look at this moment right here. If I had given up that day 43 years ago, I wouldn't be here now to help you find your way back from the edge. You wouldn't have heard my song, wouldn't have discovered that teaching is still calling to your heart." Marcus considered this, marveling at the interconnectedness of their stories. "It's like we were meant to meet here." "Maybe we were," Elena agreed. "Or maybe life is just full of opportunities for people to help each other, and we were both open enough tonight to recognize one when it appeared." She stood up slowly, stretching muscles that had been still for too long. "Come on," she said, extending her hand to Marcus. "Let's walk back to solid ground. Sitting on the edge is fine for having deep conversations, but it's not a good place to make plans for the future." Marcus took her hand and allowed her to help him to his feet. As they walked away from the canyon's edge, he felt each step taking him further from the despair that had brought him here, and closer to something he couldn't yet name but could feel growing in his chest. "What will you do when you leave here?" Elena asked as they reached the parking area where Marcus's truck sat alone under the starlight. "I honestly don't know," Marcus admitted, "but for the first time in months I'm curious about what tomorrow might bring instead of dreading it." Elena smiled and reached into her leather pouch one more time. She pulled out a small card with a phone number written on it in careful handwriting. "This is the number for Pine Ridge Adventure Camp," she said, pressing the card into his hand. "The director's name is Carol Winters. She's an old friend of mine, and she's always looking for people who understand what it means to come back from the edge." Marcus stared at the card in amazement. "How did you know to bring this?" Elena's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Let's just say I've learned to be prepared for unexpected encounters. Carol doesn't just run a summer camp, Marcus. They operate year-round now, working with kids who age out of foster care, teenagers who've been in trouble with the law, young people who don't fit into traditional schools." "That sounds like exactly the kind of work I dreamed of doing," Marcus said, his voice filled with growing excitement. "Call her tomorrow," Elena suggested. "Tell her Elena sent you, and that you're someone who understands how important it is to have someone believe in you when you've lost faith in yourself." Marcus carefully folded the card and put it in his wallet, next to the divorce papers that had seemed so heavy just hours ago. Somehow those papers felt different now too, not like an ending but like the closing of one chapter before another could begin. "Will I see you again?" Marcus asked as Elena began walking toward a path that led into the desert, away from the parking area. "That depends," Elena said with a smile. "Will you need to see me again?" Marcus thought about this seriously. "I don't know what challenges I'll face or whether I'll be strong enough to handle them. But I think I understand now that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and remembering who you really are. Then you've learned the most important lesson," Elena said. "The rest is just practice." She unslung the wooden bow from her back and held it up to catch the starlight. Before I go, I want to give you one more gift. Close your eyes and listen. Marcus closed his eyes as Elena began to play the most beautiful melody he had ever heard. It started soft and low like a lullaby, then grew stronger and more complex, telling a story without words about journeys through darkness and the dawn that always follows the longest night. When the music stopped, Marcus opened his eyes to find Elena was gone. He looked around the parking area, scanned the desert paths, but there was no sign of her. The only evidence she had ever been there was the smooth stone still warm in his pocket, the unfinished piece of wood she had let him keep, and the phone number that would change his life. Marcus stood alone under the stars for a long time, not because he was afraid to leave, but because he wanted to remember this moment forever. He wanted to remember the weight of the choice he had made, the sound of Elena's bow singing in the desert night, and the feeling of discovering that even in his darkest hour, he was not truly alone. When he finally got in his truck and started the engine, Marcus drove not toward his empty house, but toward the nearest town where he could find a motel. Tomorrow he would make the phone call that would begin his new life. But tonight he wanted to sleep somewhere different, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of his old dreams and disappointments. 3 years later, Marcus stood at the edge of the same canyon where his life had changed forever. But this time he wasn't alone. 15 teenagers from Pine Ridge Adventure Camp surrounded him, their faces glowing with excitement as they prepared for their final evening program of the wilderness therapy session. Marcus had become the head counselor at Pine Ridge 2 years ago, after proving himself as a volunteer and part-time staff member. The work was everything he had dreamed it would be and more. These kids came to the camp carrying burdens that would crush many adults: abuse, neglect, addiction, violence. But in the wilderness, away from the chaos of their regular lives, they discovered parts of themselves they never knew existed. "Mr. Marcus," called out a 16-year-old girl named Amy. "Are you sure this is safe? It looks pretty scary up here." Marcus smiled, remembering his own fear the last time he had stood in this exact spot. Amy had been at the camp for 2 months, working through her anger issues and learning to trust adults again after years in an abusive foster home. "Fear is just information, Amy," Marcus replied, using one of the phrases Elena had taught him during their many conversations over the past 3 years. "It tells us to be careful and pay attention, but it doesn't have to control our choices." He had called Carol Winters the morning after his encounter with Elena, just as he had promised. Carol had been skeptical at first. After all, Marcus had no formal training in counseling or outdoor education. But when Elena vouched for him during a surprise visit to the camp, Carol agreed to give him a chance as a volunteer. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Working with these kids had awakened something in Marcus that he didn't even know was sleeping. Every breakthrough, every moment when a withdrawn teenager suddenly opened up or an angry young person learned to channel their energy constructively, felt like a small miracle. "Tell us again about the lady with the bow," requested Jamie, a 17-year-old who had come to the camp after multiple arrests for fighting. Jamie reminded Marcus a lot of the boy named Tommy from his high school volunteer days, all rage and hurt on the surface, but desperately wanting someone to believe in him underneath. Marcus had shared Elena's story with his campers many times over the years, though he always left out the specific details of why he had been at the canyon that night. The kids didn't need to know about his own darkness. They had enough of their own to deal with. "She taught me that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers," Marcus said, settling down on a safe ledge well back from the canyon's edge. "She showed me that ending your story too early means you miss all the chapters that haven't been written yet." As he spoke, Marcus pulled out 2 items from his backpack. The first was the smooth stone Elena had given him, now polished even shinier by 3 years of carrying it in his pocket. The second was the piece of unfinished wood, which he had been slowly carving whenever he needed to think through a difficult problem or decision. "What's it going to be when it's finished?" asked Sarah, not his ex-wife, but a 14-year-old girl named after her who had come to the camp after running away from home 6 times. "I'm still not sure," Marcus admitted, turning the wood over in his hands. "But I think that's the point. Life isn't about knowing exactly where you're going. It's about staying open to possibilities and trusting that each step will reveal the next one." The sun was beginning to set, painting the canyon in the same brilliant colors Marcus remembered from that night 3 years ago. He had returned to this spot many times since then, Sometimes alone, sometimes with campers, always with gratitude for the woman who had appeared when he needed her most. He had tried to find Elena again, of course. Carol had confirmed that yes, there was an elderly woman named Elena who sometimes helped with the camp's traditional arts programs, but she seemed to come and go without warning. Some of the other staff members had stories about meeting her in the wilderness, always at moments when someone needed guidance or hope. The important thing, Marcus continued, is that Elena taught me the difference between giving up and letting go. Giving up means quitting before you've explored all your options. Letting go means releasing your grip on things that aren't serving you anymore, so your hands are free to reach for something better. He thought about his old life, the house he had lost to foreclosure, the marriage that had ended in divorce, the construction job that had never fulfilled him. At the time, losing those things had felt like the end of the world. Now he understood they had been the clearing away of obstacles that were keeping him from his true path. Marcus lived now in a small cabin on the camp property. Simple but comfortable, he had learned skills he never imagined needing. Wilderness first aid, conflict resolution, how to build a fire in the rain, how to listen to what people weren't saying. His bank account was smaller than it had ever been, but his life felt richer and more meaningful than ever before. "Did you ever see her again?" Amy asked, clearly hoping for a fairy tale ending. "Sometimes I think I do," Marcus said honestly. "Not her physical presence, but her influence. When I'm working with one of you and suddenly know exactly the right thing to say, or when I'm facing a difficult decision and the answer becomes clear, in those moments, I feel like Elena is still teaching me." As if summoned by her name, a sound drifted up from the canyon below. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the haunting melody of a wooden bow being played with masterful skill. The teenagers fell silent, straining to hear the music that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the canyon itself. Marcus felt tears coming to his eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude. 3 years ago, he had come to this place believing his story was over. Tonight, surrounded by young people who were just beginning to discover their own strength and potential, he knew the most important chapters were still being written. The music faded with the last light of the sunset, but its message lingered in the hearts of everyone who heard it. Stories don't end, they transform. People don't disappear. They become part of the love and wisdom that connects all things. And sometimes when someone needs it most, the universe conspires to send exactly the right teacher at exactly the right moment. As Marcus led his group back to camp under a sky full of stars, he touched the smooth stone in his pocket and whispered a quiet, "Thank you" to the desert wind. Somewhere in the darkness he was certain Elena smiled.